This is Hunt Nebraska, the official podcast for insight into Nebraska's hunting and shooting sports community. Be sure to give us a follow on Facebook, our space for sharing stories, information, tips, and techniques. Now, Hunt Nebraska. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hunt Nebraska cabin. It's going to be a good, fun show today. We were already kind of rolling. We should have had the audio and video going here.
No, we should not have.
I don't know about that.
You know, Hershey, we have to have standards.
We'd find out real fast, Jeff, if our bosses were listening. That's what we'd find out. Yeah.
It's always nice to get a call from the director about your podcast.
There's some things you can't explain.
We'd know the minute. So, folks, real quick, that is the Jeff Rollinson sitting right there, the man in black. Behind the mission control here, pushing the buttons, dialing the dials, toggling the switches, whatever it might be, that is our partner in crime, our shared position with the National Wild Turkey Federation, the R3 coordinator for the state of Nebraska, Michael Addison. And then right here to your, what would that be? Stage left, stage right? I never was good at theater.
Almost needs no introduction.
One of the two.
Almost needs no introduction.
That is Hunter, our coordinator for the entire state of Nebraska, Hunter Education. Me, I'm just Hershey. We are here to celebrate a lot of different things. We are in the midst, gentlemen, of the off season. The time to get ready for the upcoming season. We can dream a little bit. Obviously, this is kind of tough. I'd rather you can take advantage of the off season, but I'm not sure you can fully enjoy the off season compared to what we're off from.
Yeah. When there's no birds flying, there's no steam coming out of the duck blind with bacon and eggs crackling in the skillet. No deer stand that you're sitting in on a crisp fall morning. It just now. Of course, we got fishing, and we all know fishing and camping is, that's a pretty big deal here in the great state of Nebraska, and a lot of folks taking advantage of that right now, but we miss those hunting days.
Oh, definitely. This is probably going to be our 4th of July show right here. We'll have to keep that in mind, so we're going to have to be kind of patriotic today, guys. It depends on, obviously, when you folks out there in Outdoor Nation are listening to this podcast, but this is probably the last one we're going to get right before the holiday. It's coming up pretty fast, which is kind of nice. It's kind of that midpoint of summer, isn't it? Don't you kind of see that July 4th as
yes,
all right,
that's the hump.
Slide.
Yep.
Past summer.
And June and July are really the 2 months that you really have no game species on the calendar, right? So we've made it through June. Now we just got July, so we're really getting over the hump, in the hunting season, and because August 1st, of course, is our squirrel season. So we just got one more month to go.
One more month.
Well, in 4th of July fashion, this week we did the hunting camp here for youth at the Outdoor Education Center. So they were in the thick of learning everything hunting. But yesterday, when they were on the range shooting 20 gauge shotguns, they all broke out in the national anthem all of a sudden out of nowhere.
Did they really?
Shooting 20 gauges, learning how to shoot 20 gauges,
I knew these kids were cool.
And learning everything hunting, so that was pretty neat.
I can think of nothing more American.
I was going to say, that is just a thing of beauty. Well, you should have videotaped that thing.
Maybe somebody behind me got it. I was up on the line.
And the fact that I said videotape that just dated me, but you should have taped that anyway.
You got to have something to pop in the old VHS, don't you?
It does just sit there collecting dust. And my daughter doesn't even know what it is. It's like, that's never mind.
Well, that's pretty cool. So you go to summer camp, there's usually camp songs. You're usually singing camp songs. But that's pretty neat. The national anthem, all they're burning powder. How did that go overall? You were kind of in charge of that. That's one of those camps that has been going on for many years now, probably since the Outdoor Education Center, now called the
Turpin Outdoor
Education Center in honor of the infamous and very legendary Dick Turpin. For quite a while, and it's always kind of been the Hunter Ed coordinator that gets to oversee this hunt camp. So you've kind of been in charge of this one for what now, 2 years?
That was my first year.
This is your
helped
first year?
last year. I wasn't officially in my position yet, but no,
That's
I think
awesome.
it went pretty well. It's kind of cool because they get the full-on experience of shooting shotguns, rifles, muzzle loaders, climbing up tree stands, shooting archery, getting out in the field and
calling game.
Yep. And everything you can think of. So it's really, and then they get certified at the end in hunter education and bow hunter education. So it's the full the full-on effect in a summer camp type atmosphere, and it's just kind of cool to see kids coming in and really interested in it and really loving it, coming in every day. So
when you were a kid, any of you, when you were a kid, wouldn't it have been cool to have a hunt camp like this where you could, on the off season like this, to go and learn all these cool skills? I just think I would have loved it.
That would have been a way better way to get hunter education certified than sitting in a classroom for 10 hours.
Think about it. I'd have loved it.
You think your hunter education classroom course, and then just think completely opposite of that. Is everything, every component of it is hands-on, which is...
Yeah. Well, it's kind of cool. Like I say, they're game calling. I think most kids think of game calling. They think of somebody going, well, at the bottom of the ninth, bases are loaded. No, that's not what this is about, right? And so they think this is pretty cool. And I got to see the smiles on their faces the other day, and I mean, they were into it. And I was proud of them. But now hearing this, busting out with the national anthem on the trap range, that would have been cool. So good kids.
That is pretty neat. Now, and just thinking of some of the different topics that they got to cover that would have been, handled differently, Jeff, when you and I would have gone to summer camp. I mean, Michael, you got to talk turkey hunting with them, right?
Yeah, turkey hunting, did a little bit of trail cameras, wildlife ID, all sorts of stuff.
See, trail cameras, one of those things we probably wouldn't have.
Never would have had that at our hunt camp when we were kids.
It was just kind of the 110.
Yeah, I was going to say, his trail camera meant you were on the trail with the camera.
That was the best
Polaroid
that you were going to do. But even think about turkey hunting and the opportunities. Now we see that as oftentimes a great spot to get started, especially in a state like Nebraska, is turkey season.
Yeah.
Spring turkey season. In particular, in our day, just like, boy, to find a turkey hunter probably was kind of rare. Any idea when our first modern turkey season started here in the state of Nebraska?
Gosh.
It had to have been in the 70s.
Yeah, it was, we had stalking efforts long before that, but I'd have to look that up. But probably in the 70s that we had our first turkey hunts, probably in that range somewhere. And again, it was, you can call it that because it was, but it wasn't like 99.9% of the population
Couple counties.
Yeah, anybody knew anything about it. It's just something that a few people that probably had been pushing it and been, probably working with the commission on, stalking turkeys, whatnot, probably got involved in it. But, from a few counties, some of the public from a few counties. But it, today, like you said, it's an integral part of hunt camp, right? I mean, you wouldn't do a hunt camp in Nebraska without talking turkey hunting. But you're right, 40 years ago, nobody would have been talking, with any strength anyhow. They wouldn't have been talking too much turkey hunting.
No, maybe a little bit more on small game, rabbit, squirrel,
yeah.
Upland birds, that type of thing.
Here we have 1961 or 62.
See, I told you it's in the 60s.
Yeah.
Close.
You nailed it.
We were within the margin of error.
We're going to talk history today, so believe every day.
The margin of error was give or take a decade.
Here's a Turpin quote. These were the Merriam turkeys. The Merriam breed are really sought after, and they're considered the Cadillac of turkeys.
The Cadillac.
Not the Taj Mahal.
I was just thinking the same. I like the way old Turpin talks. See, he'd be made fun of today. You guys, I tell you. Shame.
The Taj Mahal.
Shame. By God, the Taj Mahal.
I like that Turpin went
Cadillac.
turkey.
Well, that's just, yes.
He went American.
That's 60s.
He went American on this our 4th of July show right here, folks.
I see the way you turned that around, and that was well played, Hershey. Well played.
So that's even sooner than I thought. But I'm betting turkey hunting as a whole, like you said, not many folks out there, but good times. I know when I was able to be out with them, we did zones of fire, getting them ready for their hunter ed test and getting them all prepared for the field. And we did a kind of a mock goose hunt right down here off the Jakes range, not too far outside of the Hunt Nebraska cabin folks. And it was the most, well, no, let me go the other way. It was the least goose hunting spot we have probably on the property right there in the trees. But they loved it. In fact, I got a lot of comments. Are we really going to get to shoot geese? Are we really going to be some geese out here? Just like, well, give it time. Give it time. There's plenty of mulberries here, folks, that they can, enough for everyone to share. So
I walked out the door and I saw each one of these kids wearing a goose decoy on their head, and I just turned around and walked right back in. I'm like, I don't know what the heck he's doing over there, but these kids are having a good time.
Protecting
Hunting
themselves
folks.
from the sun. And
Yeah,
95 degree heat.
Could have been. But hunting's all about hats. We're gonna have to do a podcast.
We need to do a show on hats.
Our favorite hunting hat.
Oh, yes. Who doesn't have just favorites, right? I mean, lots. I got a hat the other day. I was so proud of it. For my daughter gave it to me for Father's Day, and it says it's a camouflage hat. It has some bones on it, and it says Grandpa, P-A-W. Because I always joke about my daughter's dogs. She has these. I call them, they're my granddogs.
My mind went somewhere else. So
no, my
the new kid at home, it kind of does, doesn't it?
Don't even think about it. But because I always call them my granddogs, because she's got a big old Mastiff and then a black lab, and so I call them my granddogs, and so I got my Grandpa, P-A-W hat. So anyway, that might be, it's camouflage. It might become one of the better duck hunting hats now, really? Because it's just nostalgia. Words. Well, they gotta have. Most of your favorite hats have two things: comfort and nostalgia. And so I think there might be a
little sweat too. I think.
Well, especially in the summertime,
just a little.
It's the adhesive. Well, to help celebrate our independence here in the great nation and the state of Nebraska, why not take a peek back at how we got to where we are nowadays?
Proud tradition.
We talk about it quite a bit in our jobs. I mean, folks, we get to talk hunting and shooting sports quite a bit. We get to talk about our funding model and where the conservation funds are, and that comes from you. The recreational shooter, the hunters out there that are listening to this, you should be proud of that. But it's kind of unique. We kind of take that for granted here in the United States as a whole. And dare I say, even within our own borders of the state, not knowing exactly where all that money comes from. In fact, you guys have probably been involved in this field long enough to think that, or hear that someone says, well, I pay taxes, I pay your salary. And there's not many people that pay our salary, be quite honest with you, especially in our area in hunter education and hunting and shooting outreach. It comes from those that take advantage of the hunting opportunities we have here in the state of Nebraska, and the recreational shooters that burn powder breaking blue rock or with the pistol or a long range rifle. It doesn't really matter. It goes right into archers as well. Yeah. And it's kind of neat story, I think.
Oh, it's a cool story.
How we got there, partly by design, partly, I want to say, just by, where we were in the new world.
Divine providence, I think, to some degree.
And Jeff, I know you've done plenty of talks on this. You actually take it back quite a ways.
It starts quite a ways
before
back.
Even much of our country was even thought of.
It really does. It starts quite a ways back because our model of course we're in the 1800s. What were we? In the United States, we were a lot of a melting pot from a lot of different countries. Prominently represented as that European descent, right? And so that was a huge influence on the people of settling North America in the 1600s, 1700s, and that's it starts long before then, because if we we'll understand that America was prominently represented by European descent. You go all the way back to feudal Europe because that's where a lot of our values came, a lot of our understanding of common law and of wildlife and ownership and so forth. And if you go back that far, and you kind of have to, you got to think that when people were escaping England, they were escaping a very oppressive type regime where it was the king, and the king owns everything. A little bit of divinity worked in there, for whatever reason, and you didn't have a lot of say, right? And so, here's this world in Europe, and they've kind of hunted a lot. They've there's not a lot of game populations continue to decline over the centuries in Europe because of their model their model of conservation. But we left that model and came over here to the United States. Of course, everybody knows the story. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, there was a lot of that happening over those centuries. But when we got here, you got to think it was like kids in a candy store because all of a sudden you've got access to game and fish and fowl and whatnot, and nobody's there to tell you can't touch it. In fact, no one's going to cut your arm off or kill your family if you hunt the deer or whatever.
Well, think about it. The resources over there on that island, for the most part, pretty finite to say the least, and spoken for and tied up. And when you get over here, like you said, just almost limitless.
It was limitless.
I mean, you can't see the end of it, and the only person that you might make mad way over on the other side of the ocean.
Way on the other side of the ocean.
I mean, it's just
It's
kind
going
of
to take
like
months to find
you know,
out.
yeah, they ever know.
By the time King George or whatever here, it was kind of like that. And in reality, yes, throughout most of feudal Europe, the king owned everything, right? You couldn't touch anything. Something phenomenal happened over the history of feudal Europe, and it really comes to a boil in 1215 A.D. with the signing of the Magna Carta, and that was King John against the rebellious land barons of the time. But one of the things that did, and it's a very important mark in the history of North American model of conservation, is it set on a path, Europe, and of course our values coming from Europe, that the wildlife didn't belong to the king, they belonged to the people. Now, there's a staunch difference that we'll talk about here, but in Europe that maintained belonged to the people. And of course, the only people that could own anything would be the rich land barons. And so throughout most of history in Europe, that model of conservation has been people who have wealth, people who own land, they have the rights to the wildlife and the natural resources. When we came over here, we kind of brought some of that with us. However, it was such a, like you said, Hershey, such a vast network of opportunity that no one really cared about who owned the wildlife, right? It just belonged to the commons almost, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody had access to it. Now, there were certainly tragedies involved in that with, nobody owns the wildlife, but, one group, say Native Americans, of course, depend on that wildlife. Now they got these, Europeans that are coming in here and they're depending on the wildlife. And so there was that, but the reality of it was nobody owned it and everybody just, kept, if stock got low, just move west.
Yeah, it was a common resource.
It was a common resource for everybody. And that went on for a long time. And it didn't change until we got into the 1700s and we realized that, the king cannot demand for us to send over feathers and send over hides and to do all the things that we were being asked to do and then tax us and all. We decided that, and what's interesting is it was the actual signing of the Magna Carta that gave folks like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, gave them the idea that we have our rights too. There are certain unalienable rights that the king does not have rights over. And King saw it differently, right? And so what do? Well, we start a series of skirmishes that lead to an entire Revolutionary War that changed the course of history for the world in 1776. And right after that, in 1780, or 1780, in that ballpark, we began to realize that, we've taken the reins of government over. The king does no longer have any rights or power over the sovereignty of North America. That was huge. And so, as Locke wrote in many of his philosophical writings throughout history, throughout that time, that, it was kind of like, the tragedy, right? It was the greatest wholesale slaughter of wildlife and natural resources the world had ever seen in the late 1700s all the way to the 1800s. And that was a huge problem because there was, again, as you said, Hershey, nobody owned the wildlife. Everybody owned the wildlife. And but nobody thought of it that way. It was just there for the taking. And no one had responsibility for it. And it probably wasn't until 1842 that we start to see some direction by the Supreme Court here in the United States, this newly established United States, and this democratic experiment that nobody thought would work. But in 1842, with the ruling that by the Supreme Court that stated that once a gentleman in New Jersey was collecting oysters in a river, and it was being challenged that river belonged to someone who had a land grant from the Duke of Earl all the way back into the 1700s. And the Supreme Court said, that's just not the case. As soon as this country won its independence from Great Britain, all the wildlife, the flora and the fauna became immediately invested in the people. Now, at the time, the people were not individuals necessarily, but it was the states. But the states were run by the people. So in essence, it was basically saying that the wildlife belongs to the people. Phenomenal ruling. No other country has that. But our model of conservation is predicated by the fact that since that ruling, everybody owns the wildlife.
And it's interesting. I know that it's not, like I said, it's called the North American model. We definitely live by it here in the great U.S. of A. Not something that goes all the way back to the, Declaration of Independence or the writing of the Constitution and our forefathers and all that type of stuff. They didn't give wildlife a whole bunch of thought in
Nothing.
it, but it just kind of gradually over time evolved to
Yeah.
It's of the people.
Well, you think about it. I mean, you're a brand new country. You're expanding westward, exploring new lands, and that's probably not the first thought of, hey, we need to manage this.
No,
so,
of course
so
not.
we can
This
continue
unlimited
to do
resource.
this.
Go west.
Just keep going, keep
That's
exploring.
right.
There's a lot other priorities. So it's honestly surprising how quickly we did come to that Supreme Court decision, which really paved the way for modern
really
wildlife management.
It really did, and it's again, when people ask me, if you could define how our model evolved, I always say, kind of, take it how you want, but divine providence, because there was just so many things that happened, and you go through history, and I'll stake my hat on this too, that the Revolutionary War had to end like it ends in order to have our model of conservation. We had to have George Washington in order to have our model of conservation. George Washington had to not die in so many skirmishes where he should have died, almost died. It was even, if I recall, I forget his name, unfortunately, but of one of the tribes that when Washington was here in the United States fighting on behalf of the British near Fort Duquesne, and the chief they were fighting against and his warriors stated that he was a man that could not be killed. In later interviews, he was in the late 1700s. He was stating that he had told his people to quit wasting any of their time on their leader, because he was a man of destiny who could not be killed, because he had never been known to miss, and he missed Washington like 6 or 7 times, shot his buckles cufflinks off, his buckles off of his belt, shot his hat off, went through his coat, shot a horse out from under him, but Washington was unscathed. And
he was a pretty big target,
and he was a big guy, 6'2". I mean, everybody else was my size back then, and so he was a pretty towering figure. Yeah, I thought you'd like that. But anyway.
I've heard you called fun-sized. I've never heard you called historical-sized. That's interesting. We're going to have to go with that. Yeah.
We're going to start.
You're not much taller, buddy.
Doesn't take much.
And here we see Jeff Rawlinson. He's a good reference for the height of the people at the time.
That's right. 5'7" was about the height, and then here's Washington towering at 6'2". Enough. Washington towering at 6'2". And so he stood out quite a bit. So and then the Civil War. A lot of things had to happen the way they happened for our model of conservation. So there's a lot of things that came together that I think are quite remarkable. But the 1842 Supreme Court Act is what made wildlife, to me, made wildlife common. It's the public trust doctrine is what evolved out of that. That wildlife is held in a public trust to be managed by folks like our agency here today for the benefit of the public.
Now, we had some ups and downs in the learning curve of how to manage wildlife, and that could be a whole nother show.
Yeah.
In predator control, and if we just add more here and introduce this species and all sorts of ups and downs in that, because even after that time, bison on the prairies.
Oh, yeah.
In some spots, still relatively numerous.
By the millions. They were by the millions.
And, we saw that as, a resource that we could all take advantage of and did for various reasons, but not something that was limitless like we first thought of.
It wasn't at all. And you hear the stories of it taking a bison herd 3 days to cross the Platte River. It wasn't because they couldn't figure out how to cross the Platte River. It's because there were so many million. It took the herd 3 days to finish that crossing. And so, and of course, what happened? Well, again, there was tragedy of the commons. That's a lot of what we see play out in the 1800s. Wildlife belongs to everybody. Big whoop if you're not going to manage it correctly. And so 1842 landmark decision wasn't very powerful in terms of doing much for wildlife until we get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we have almost wiped out the bison. Hershey bringing up the bison, it's not only because of the fact that it was this big megafauna critter that represented wildlife of North America, but it also represented the thoughts and the heart of a very prominent conservationist that came to the forefront in the late 1800s. And if he doesn't come to the forefront, wildlife conservation does not look at all. Our model doesn't look the same. And that's Teddy Roosevelt. And when he came to the forefront, he had already made his trip out west to Maduro, South Dakota, and to the Badlands. He had written back to his wife that he was in awe with the adventure and the landscape, and he wanted to bison. And then his attitude started to change in his writings back home, and he wrote back to Alice and said that, to his family and said that he was getting concerned that he would never see a bison, that he might have missed the Wild West by just a few years, and he was very distraught. And then the letter came back saying that he had found a massive bull and he had harvested it, and kind of that sigh, he said, "I'm afraid I may have taken the last bison in North America." And so, I mean, it was just the Wild West had come to an end right before his very eyes, and that had a profound impact on Teddy Roosevelt. And when he comes back from the West, he comes back a changed person. He comes back somebody that understands wildlife conservation and the need for this country to make some changes.
Do you remember when he went on that hunt?
Oh boy, 1880 something, I would imagine.
Because it's interesting now in Kansas, they've got a lot of records because that was one of the shipping areas. Dodge City, one of the infamous western frontier towns of the time, kept some pretty good details of how many bison hides and how much meat went through that area in the first 3 months of 1872. So not too much before Mr. Roosevelt went through on his bison hunt. More than 43,000 buffalo hides, nearly 1.5 million pounds of meat were shipped to the east on the Santa Fe Railroad. That's just the first 3 months of that year, and you've got millions that went through there in a really short amount of time. Another online search here says between 1871 and 75, 4 million bison killed to ship 1.4 million hides from Dodge City, Kansas to the east. It didn't take long.
No, it didn't. In fact, put it in perspective here. In 1776, we fight our War of Independence. In 1876, we had done a lot right, but we had done a lot wrong. And in fact, Fort Benton, Montana was where we kind of officially document the bison shipment, the bison hides.
From the northern herds.
Yep. And within just a few years of that, 1876, and I think it was 1881, they went from, like 80,000 down to zero. In that, it was about a 7-year period where we pretty much all but lost the bison. It was an interesting time, 1876. I mean, it was an interesting time. 100 years we celebrate. That's about the time that Roosevelt went to college, went to Harvard. It was the same year that the infamous battle at the Little Bighorn. Lot changed in that 100 years, and but what we see that represents the changing in the landscape is that you nailed it, the bison hide shipment.
Yep, and it'd take a little bit to, like you said, we had some folks trying to do what they could for our wildlife, and I think, even nowadays, we're still we've got lots to learn. We still working on the science and all that stuff, because as things adapt and as the world in which we all live in, including our wildlife, changes, we've got to keep vigilant on all that stuff. But, it's many years afterwards that we start even seeing protection for these commonly held resources such as our wildlife.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, we realized that there was a model that we had to develop. It was always evolving. It still is today. There is no specific capsulated model. It's always evolving. But at the turn of the century, we realized, of course, Roosevelt did, that our wildlife was being decimated. We had to do something. We had to make some decisions, and we had to do something quick. What Roosevelt did was he brought this. It was a rod and gun club discussion. It was all the rod and gun clubs across North America. It was fledgling magazines like Field and Stream that were starting to say, "Hey, this has got to change, America. We cannot continue." There was all kinds of cartoons that were just doom and gloom, decimation. In fact, if you see some of those cartoons from that early 1900s, you see nothing but just just ragged old deer standing up, poor thing, almost has a cane, sitting up on top of the hill overlooking a destroyed landscape. It was just doom and gloom. And Roosevelt made this conversation a political conversation to the people. It was interesting that it had to become that way. Now, we have some other figures that stand out, because if somebody like J. Ding Darling didn't come to the forefront, the conservation conversation that Hershey talks about every Thursday night on our radio show would not have been in the household at the dinner table or the breakfast table of every house in America. J. Ding Darling made that conversation something that the American people needed to take root on. And, of course, it was this big resurgence of going to the outdoors, going to Yellowstone, going to the parks. And so people were starting to take note at the turn of the century that this isn't good. But like you said, we didn't have any way to, we knew we had some wildlife principles at the time. Yeah, let's kill predators. Let's do this. What we didn't have was anybody that was trained in good wildlife principles, and we didn't have any money. I mean, we realized, even Roosevelt was realizing, and then Franklin was realizing that this is going to take millions of dollars, and we've got to have the states manage their wildlife. We had nobody to do it and no money, even if we did. And so, again, you can call it what you want, but things just had to fall into place at the right time. And so they did just that.
They did. I think some of the first game wardens came on, after the beginning of the 20th century, early on, that weren't necessarily what we'd think of as a conservation officer today by any means. They were, like you said, Jeff, kind of hired to oversee certain areas to kind of protect what it was. But it is kind of interesting. Going back to the old, we'll call it the European system of wildlife management, I dare say in a lot of cases, because of the area that they're talking about and how many folks have lived there and how manicured their wild areas and spots are. I mean, the Black Forest hand planted, right? In rows. A forest in Germany or a lot of European countries doesn't look anything like a forest does here in the States, because it had to be maintained. Yeah. I dare say wildlife's the same thing over there in a lot of those countries. Management might not be the word I think of. Yeah. More of a manipulated is probably what I'd say. Because if you think about it, the game that they hunt in Europe, it's oftentimes things like pheasants and partridge and stag and all that stuff, all non-natives for the most part. Yeah. Had to be introduced, had to be stocked, had to be taken care of. So even that side of it's a little bit different. Where here we prize native, we prize that naturalized critter that out there. Not saying that all of our game animals by any means are native. Pheasant, one of my favorite things to pursue, obviously a naturalized citizen of the U.S. now, but still managed in that they're taking care of themselves. There's wild populations.
Yeah, and exactly right.
Yeah. Well, imagine being back when the Game and Parks here in Nebraska was established in the early 1900s, and all the other state fish and wildlife agencies start getting established before and around the same time. And like Hershey said, mainly just game wardens there to enforce the few laws that were on the books, and then you start to see the need for, what are we basing these decisions on? How are we going to manage this wildlife? What laws need to be in place so we can maintain these populations for the next generations?
It had to be daunting, to be honest with you. The advent of the game warden was critical, right? And these guys were tough. They were cut from a different cloth. They were tough. And, they kind of epitomize the ideology of what a game warden is today, right? Yeah. I always look at our game wardens as, there's law enforcement, which we all have, incredible reverence for, but then there's our game wardens. These guys and gals are tough. And they are serious about what they do. But we had to have that game warden early on, because without the game warden, what good's a law if you can't enforce it, right? Again, goes back to tragedy of the commons. Everybody, nobody's managing anything, and of course that's a problem. And so the advent of the game warden, and there's all kinds of historical record stories of these game wardens. They were getting involved in stamping out not just game laws, but organized crime even. They were involved, and so they were tough dudes, no question about that. But again, fledgling states, fledgling fish and wildlife agencies, just getting started. Nebraska was like, I think, 1901, if I'm not mistaken, but just getting started, no money, no model, and that kind of went on for quite a few years. And then we get into the late 1920s and early 1930s, and we got another giant of a man in terms of president, and that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he and Jay Darling didn't get along real well. There was some back and forth. Darling wrote some cartoons about Roosevelt that he didn't appreciate, and there was back and forth. But he did realize the value in Darling, and he realized that Darling had quite a following, and so they were able to come together on some of the conservation issues. And I think Darling might have pushed Roosevelt as much as Roosevelt pushed Darling, but out of that synergy and that interaction, we start to see big legislation like the federal duck stamp, and I think that's something that was huge. Millions and millions of dollars collected for wildlife conservation through hunters buying that federal duck stamp. Huge. In 1936, we started to realize that the funding issue had come to a boil. But it always took passionate people, and this is what I think is so cool. The most phenomenal piece of legislation that conservation in any part of the world has ever known would be the passage in 1937 of the Pittman-Robertson Act, and that act took an existing 10% tax on firearms and ammunition and diverted it from the current use to states for their fish and wildlife agencies for for the sole purpose of conservation funding. And that set the North American model on a course that the world has never seen and no other country could even touch now. It's just boom. It propelled conservation into the forefront. And so that's pretty phenomenal. And what we saw happening there, the act itself is interesting. And I always like history. There's always more to the story, and I always like history. That particular act, it was the head of the Carl Shoemaker, the head of the Oregon fishing game. He was an attorney from Ohio, and just one of those average guys, and this is what I love about our story, one of those average guys whose heart and soul was in hunting, waterfowl hunting, wildlife habitat, and he realized that this was a problem, and he realized that there's an opportunity here. Congress was trying to sunset that tax on the firearms ammunition because the dirty 30s. You all know what happened in the 30s. The Dust Bowl. No one had any money. It was bad time, and so Congress was going to sunset that act. And Carl Shoemaker had an idea. What if we divert that act? And so he met with State Senator of Nevada, Robertson, and he laid out his idea, wrote it down on paper, and said, "Here's what I'm thinking." And he said, "I'll sign on to that." He said, "That I can do," and he'll bring a lot of votes with it. But he said, "There's missing words in here." And again, you talk about getting to the right person at the right time. Robertson was a curmudgeon old, a sage stalwart in Congress, and he said he wrote down 29 words, and they've become somewhat famous. And he gave it back to Shoemaker on that piece of paper during their lunch meeting, and he said, "I'll sign on if these words are interjected." And basically, those words stated that the funds, the state fish and wildlife agencies, could not divert their license and permit sale funding from any purpose outside other than conservation if they are to receive these federal funds. And he saved the day. You think about it, the World War II, and then of course all these other wars after that, and all these other uses for funds throughout North America. Those monies have survived in conservation. Not always popular, right? Yep. But they've survived in conservation over that time. So pretty darn cool.
It is, and just to reemphasize what you said, Jeff, during some of the bleakest times here in North America and in the United States during the Great Depression. That we still use that name. 34, first duck stamp. 37, Pittman-Robertson Act. I mean, it just...
Boom, boom, boom.
I mean, it's kind of forward-thinking people. Now, I don't know if any of them realized just how big of impact that they were going to have, because those things, for the most part, have gone relatively unchanged from that day forward once they all moved through. The duck stamp, obviously, provided millions and millions of dollars towards wildlife conservation and the purchase of some ground to help protect some of those vital nesting areas and wintering areas and migration areas. And then obviously the Pittman-Robertson Act, or what we now know as the Wildlife Restoration Act, huge. I mean, 75-80% of our wildlife agency as a whole funded by that excise tax, which is now being paid again by hunters as well as those recreational shooters, where we've really picked up some steam.
You'd be seeing, if that act doesn't pass, I'd go on the ledge here saying you would be seeing wildlife in zoos. Where wouldn't have wild places and wild things.
That would be an interesting exercise, wouldn't it?
Well, and it's interesting
because
would
that money come from, if anywhere?
The cool thing about 1937 almost helps the act, because it was an act that by itself maybe wasn't, the American people were ready for it because of the Roosevelts and the Rod and Gun Clubs and people like Gifford Pinchot and whatnot. They're ready for it. Mm-hmm. But it needed support still. And of course, what's happened in 1937? Of course, the Depression, right? So nobody has money. And there was a bill in Congress that was called the Milk and Cheese Bill, and it was a bill for unwed moms who were having a rough go of it during the Depression to provide some needed funding support for food for these folks. The bill was part of that bill, and the bill was actually failing in Congress. It wasn't getting pushed very hard by a devout hunter who was the head of the Ag Committee. And so what did one man that had such an impact, what did Carl Shoemaker do? He gets on the phone and starts calling these garden clubs, mom garden clubs all across the country, saying your milk and cheese bill is not doing well and you're not going to get the support you guys are thinking you're getting. And those mom garden clubs start calling around, and pretty soon the milk and cheese bill flies through Congress, and right on the tail with it is the greatest conservation bill the world's ever seen. Pretty cool. Pretty phenomenal.
And then right about, before then, about that same time, Aldo Leopold obviously had an impact on, the scientific side of, father of wildlife ecology, the father of how we, really began establishing the science of what state fish and wildlife agencies, what wildlife managers do. And he obviously had an impact on that bill too, and on our whole field. But that's really kickstarted where, establishment of wildlife biologists at state fish and wildlife agencies, and the funding just followed right after that, which really all of that came together in a matter of 30 years. The funding, the science, the politics. That's really amazing how it happened.
And I understand Hershey's related to Aldo Leopold. So he came from Iowa. Hershey, is he like a distant uncle, or what's the?
Well, two of us get to claim
great grandfather.
Two of us get to claim some ownership.
Both
there
of you here,
because he grew up in Iowa. He spent time in a lot of different places, but his Sand County Almanac was written in Sand County, Wisconsin.
A fake Sand County, but yeah. I've been to the Aldo Leopold shack. We were just in Albuquerque near where he lived in New Mexico when he was.
Yeah, he got around. I mean, he wasn't
especially
very
for the times.
Yeah, exactly. And you bring up an incredible point though, because and Hunter, you nailed it right there. Because again, we have money now, but we had the game warden. But we need trained biologists, people who understand natural systems and ecology and biology and the relationship between wildlife, resources, and people. And we didn't have a lot of that. And Aldo Leopold comes onto the scene, and I mean, it's just like, boom, here is the handbook for teaching wildlife biology students. And in the Sand County Almanac, which is it's a neat book. It really is. It's the basic reading. I mean, you can't go through a wildlife college in North America without being made to read the Sand County Almanac, I don't think. And it's pretty darn cool. But the changings in the seasons over time there in Sand County and how he observed all these things. Yeah, I always tell people if Sand County Almanac taught us anything, it's how to observe.
There you go. So where is the cabin or where he ended his days? I guess he was fighting the wildfire, if I remember correctly, but he spent a lot of time in Wisconsin and taught at one of the universities.
He taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that's the shack that his property was in near Baraboo, Wisconsin, just a little bit north of Madison. On the Baraboo and Wisconsin River there. So it's a pretty neat spot, kind of cool to see where he was when he was writing that piece and a lot of his other pieces, and at the end of his life when he's putting it all into perspective.
I don't get a claim near the connection you're trying to grant me here, Jeff, with Leopold. He was born in Burlington, Iowa. I will say my college professor and advisor for many years and still a good friend, Dr. James Pease, grew up in that same area and actually used maps that Aldo and his brother had put together of the back channels and sloughs of the Mississippi River. And those two knew each other pretty darn well in the time that their lives overlapped. Didn't get to meet Aldo by any means, but spent a lot of time with his brother, which was kind of cool.
We both have
hearing the stories. So
people who were very close to Aldo Leopold
there you go.
in our career. And so it's kind of interesting, but that's pretty darn cool.
Yep.
We'd love to have those maps. Wouldn't that be neat?
That is. Well, folks, we're kind of coming to the end of this podcast. I think we have a whole lot more to talk about because we're still making some gains. And I know once Aldo kind of helped shape that idea that we just can't do predator control. We can't just address one part of the system without affecting another part of the system. And we started the idea of, well, maybe we need to think of what type of conditions these animals need to survive and nest or fawn or live in and winter in and all that type of stuff as a whole system. Boy, we made some leaps and bounds, and we continue to do so. So, folks, we're going to have to put a ribbon on it right there, but make sure you enjoy the 4th of July, celebrate independence as best you can, because we do live in not only the best state, but one of the best countries in the entire nation, and we're afforded these opportunities for a whole bunch of reasons, including these forward-thinking individuals and opportunities and divine intervention, perhaps, as well, to get where we are. So make sure you give us a big old thumbs up, a like, make some comments down below if you want to add some more to the conversation, but we want to know what you're thinking, as well as we need to let you know when the next one of these drops. But until next time, Hunt Nebraska, brought to you by your Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.